This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 191 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest for today is Kevin Bryant. Kevin graduated from the University of California at Santa Cruz with a BA in history and graduated with top honors from American Military University with an MA in intelligence studies and an MS in sports management. He served more than 20 years with the United States Army, both as a soldier and civilian, during which he conducted national security investigations and trained federal agents. I invited Kevin onto the podcast to discuss his book, Spies on the Sidelines: The High-Stakes World of NFL Espionage, which was published in 2022. It's the story of how NFL teams have used intelligence collection techniques for decades to give themselves the edge over their opponents, and how sometimes those techniques have backfired spectacularly. But before we get into this story, you should know that OC Strategic Academy is here to teach you how to transform your career with the skill of a spy. With OC Strategic Academy, you can learn to understand people on a deeper level, influence decisions and build connections, and gain the edge you've been missing in work, in life, and in every interaction. Each course has been developed by a former war reporter turned human intelligence collector with extensive experience in the Middle East. The courses include Negotiate Like a Spy and Network Like a Spy, plus several others. There's also private one-on-one coaching available if you're interested in training that is tailored directly to your needs. You can find them at academy.ocstrategic.com and use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 to get 10% off any course you decide is right for you. Click the link in the show notes of this episode to level up your human intelligence skills. Kevin, thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Justin.
Of course, I have to admit that until I found your book, I never expected to talk about professional sports here on the podcast. But now that I've read it, I wish that I'd gotten in touch with you a lot sooner, because this topic is perfectly suited for this podcast and for my audience. And it was very fascinating and just like a real breath of fresh air for me, honestly.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Of course. So, because like I just said, it is a little bit unusual. Can you tell me why you decided to write a book on this subject in the first place? Because I believe you said that this is maybe the only book on this subject right now.
Yeah, it is. So, I was like a lot of aspiring authors out there, which, I wanted to write. I just didn't know what I wanted to write about. And then Spygate happened. And then kind of what's termed Spygate 2, when Josh McDaniels moved over to the Broncos. His videographer was caught recording another team's practice. And being a Broncos fan myself at that point, I just really began to question how much intelligence gathering goes on in professional football. And I started doing some research on the internet, saw that there's quite a bit and quite a few different techniques and tactics are used and involved in it. And so, I hopped on Amazon and looked for a book on the subject. And there was nothing else. There's nothing out there. So at that point I said, you know what? Given that, I work in the field of collecting and protecting information, I've got my, master's degree in intelligence studies. I felt like it would be and another master's degree in sports management. I felt like it would be a really good fit of my capabilities and a subject that I had a lot of interest in myself, being a lifelong NFL fan.
Yeah, it seems like you were just like exactly the right guy in the right place and time. And I am shocked because of how prevalent it was, which I didn't realize until I read the book. But I'm just shocked that nobody else has written about this before. But thank goodness you did,
Yeah, absolutely.
So one thing that you mentioned early on that kind of surprised me initially is that there is apparently a lot more of this kind of, professional espionage going on in the NFL than other sports. Why is that exactly?
Well, I think it's because most sports are free flowing. You think of soccer, you think of basketball, hockey, for example. The action doesn't stop very often. And because of that, there's less coaching influence in those sports than there is in football. The pauses in the game in football allow opportunities for collection to be done and for information to be used strategically. For example, the use of, for a long time, hand signals were used to send in plays. And so that, that gave an opponent the opportunity to try to figure out what those signals corresponded to in the upcoming play. And that type of thing just really isn't possible in most sports, in like soccer, for instance. When you're gathering intelligence, other than, let's say, free kicks or maybe a penalty kick, there's really not much you can gain from spying on another team's practice or trying to gather information on your opponent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense now that I think about it, certainly. And I have to tell you, I really loved about your book that it is just so completely chock full of anecdotes, one after the other, because that's kind of my thing, right? Is like sharing these summaries of these anecdotes through history. And you just found, it seems like hundreds upon hundreds of them throughout, decades of history, which was really incredible. So I can't imagine the number of books and articles you had to read. Honestly, I'm curious, this has been going on so long, and of course they've, techniques have evolved to guard against it, which I'm sure we'll get into. But do you think that this whole level of collection that's going on, has it had like a decisive impact on entire seasons or on championships and that sort of thing throughout? Or is it sort of like I don't know if I call it an annoyance, but a complication perhaps?
No, it has absolutely had a huge impact on games. And if you go through and read the book, you're going to see the stories in there. So many of those are based on Super Bowls of the advantages that a team acquired based on, everything from permissible techniques to stuff that's in the gray to stuff that's not permitted. Yeah, Super Bowls are won and lost on this stuff. And so absolutely, it's had a huge, huge impact in the league and on key games.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's really fascinating that there's this. Of course, I know it's not totally unseen because, like you mentioned, Spygate and Deflategate and that kind of thing. So it's not totally unseen, but it just comes down to so much more than just the prowess or the planning of the athletes and the coaches and all that. Clearly, there's a whole other, semi-hidden level to the entire sport, which is just fascinating. So one of the techniques you talked about early on was skunking. So can you tell me what that is and how prevalent it is?
Yeah. So skunking is basically just spying on practices. So it used to be a lot simpler to do in the NFL. When the league first started up, teams were using, sometimes community fields, sometimes high school fields to practice on. And they didn't have security guards. There wasn't fencing, or if there was fencing, it wasn't anything like what you would think of today. So back in the day, I would say probably up until you're really talking about probably till about the 80s, there was a lot of it that went on. Today, it is certainly much tougher. How much goes on is questionable. But, just to give you an idea, I will tell you this. When Peyton Manning was with the Broncos, and before they played the Patriots in New England, he actually had the Broncos stop the bus in the middle of nowhere, get out into a forest, and actually do a practice run of the plays there in the forest versus, team typically goes to the practice field and they do a walkthrough practice. But, Peyton Manning believed so heavily that the Patriots were involved on spying on those walkthrough practices that the Broncos took extreme measures to help prevent that. So it's very much something that teams are very paranoid of today. And, if teams are willing to go to that extreme to try to protect what's going on, that just tells me that absolutely teams are involved in spying and they're going after it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's incredible. That's such a simple yet creative solution. Just run the plays out the middle of nowhere, unscheduled stop. That's really, really smart. And I don't want to get too far off track right now because we'll probably talk about him later on. But Peyton Manning, he just came up and up again and again in this book. And it became very clear to me that not only is he a very talented quarterback, but extremely good at the collection and the protection, like you mentioned very early on. I mean, he had it all, every which way there was, honestly. So super impressive guy. I mean, he really went up a notch or two in my book.
Yeah, very, very smart quarterback. These guys that are winning championships, whether it's elite quarterbacks, whether you're talking elite coaches, they are all very, very aware of this stuff. I would argue it's difficult to win, especially a Super Bowl, if you're not especially protecting your information. If you're not going to get crazy about collecting, and all teams have engaged in various forms of collection, but if you're not going to get into, let's say, the black arts, which many coaches don't, they're at least aware and taking measures to prevent other teams from doing so.
Mm-hmm. So I understand the preventative measures, but once it actually occurs, like if you do catch an employee or assistant coach or whoever skunking your team, is there anything that can really be done at that point, or do you just have to avoid?
Yeah. So, teams have been caught in the act before. So I'll give you an example of this. George Allen with the Rams. So he was known as one of the coaches that was very much involved in questionable collection techniques. So back in '66, he was the coach of the Rams, and his team was facing the Cowboys. And the Cowboys staff noticed someone sitting in a car next to the practice field, and they went to go investigate. And when they did, the car just took off immediately. The Cowboys employee happened to be able to note down the license plate and went in and they conducted an investigation, found out the car was rented out to a member of the Rams staff. And at that point, the Cowboys brought their complaint to the NFL commissioner. The Rams shot back and said, hey, well, we saw a member of the Cowboys staff up in a tree spying on one of our practices. At which the commissioner's like, look, all I've got right now is a bunch of hearsay. And, the Rams were involved in the classic tactic of, deny, and make counter accusations, which is they accused a member of the Cowboys staff of doing the spying who weighed over 300 pounds of climbing up in the tree. So I'm not sure how realistic any of this was.
Wow.
But it was enough that the commissioner just said, hey, everybody knock it off, go back to your corners and behave appropriately.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
And this is so far back too. I mean, I'm sure I know that it has, continued to evolve since then. So do they have like people watching, like security guards or, facing all four directions during practices, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So absolutely. So most NFL teams, what they will have, they have a security staff that's going to, before a practice, they're going to sweep the field to make sure that there's nobody in the immediate area. So there's no one in any bushes or any trees or anywhere, inside of a stadium that can possibly be hiding there, because teams have hidden personnel inside of all of those places before to spy on practices. And then, if there are high-rise buildings around there, they're probably going to have guards with binoculars looking inside of these buildings to see, hey, is anyone just sitting out there spying on our practices? Particularly if there are hotels in the area, which are infamous sites, which, they're great sites for spies to be able to use because you can just rent out a room. Mm-hmm. And if they're up there on the 15th floor overlooking it, they can have binoculars, they could have a whole video recorder set up, taping the entire practice. Mm-hmm. So teams are very paranoid about that. And so they absolutely take measures. They'll coordinate with a local hotel staff and just say, hey, if you guys notice anything peculiar, anyone coming in, asking for a floor on the 15th level that overlooks the stadium, then please, give us a call. Here's my business card. Give me a call and let me know what's going on. So all that type of stuff takes place.
Yeah, that was shocking to me. I think that you had at least one anecdote, or maybe it's a common practice, that one of the teams would just reserve every room with a window facing the practice field every time they were out there, right? Is that like pervasive, or is that just a one-time occasion?
Yeah, no. So that absolutely, that goes on. There've been quite a few teams that, particularly when you're playing a division rival, right? Cowboys with the Redskins, for instance, that was always that was a big rivalry back in the day. Still is a big rivalry, but you get coaches that are absolutely paranoid that another team is spying on them, especially if you get a coach that has a bit of a name for it. That goes on. So at that point, yeah, teams have they absolutely will rent out. They'll rent out all the rooms in a hotel just to make sure that an opponent can't spy on them, which is insane. Well, at least all the rooms that are of a height sufficient enough to
sure.
be able to use, at a height and on the side appropriate to be able to use for spying. So, which is kind of crazy because let's say if you got a 20-story hotel and, from the 10th level up, it could be used to be able to watch practices. You're potentially, renting out at least 50 rooms there, so, teams are willing to go to an extreme cost, but, when you got to realize that for every win or loss in the NFL, you're talking about tens of millions. Those are worth tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And so, renting out a bunch of hotel rooms, that's really just petty cash for them.
Just like you mentioned a moment ago, asking about any unusual people showing up at the hotel. When I first read that in the book, I thought to myself, wow, does that even work? I mean, what do the hotel staff care? And then right away, you answered my question for me because you mentioned that the home teams, of course, they have this level of loyalty that they can kind of call on, which I had never even considered before. But like, it's almost like having a ready-made, like turnkey network of your own, because you've got thousands of loyal fans in your hometown who are just naturally going to watch out for anybody who's, trying to hurt you.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
Super cool. Super cool. I hadn't considered that at all, but that's one huge advantage that professional sports teams definitely bring. So are these techniques, or really any of the stuff we're going to talk about, do these have any like criminal ramifications if they're caught, or is it just like interleague decisions and that sort of thing, like maybe a fine or something like that from within the league?
Yeah. So, that gets really interesting. I mean, obviously we've got Spygate out there, right? And, with Spygate, we saw the league really come down hard. With Deflategate, we saw the same thing. There's a punishment, there's fines, there are draft pick consequences. So yes, that can take place. Having said that, the league does not want to issue any of those out. Really, the league does its utmost to make sure that none of this stuff ever comes out in the light of day. And so, because when you think about it, think of an event like Spygate or Deflategate. You've got all these people that are going to say, you know what? This other team's cheating. The game is rigged. These guys are winning Super Bowls and it's not fair. And furthermore, I'm not going to watch anymore because I think this is just all a bunch of garbage. It was the same thing when you had players not saluting, not standing up for the national anthem. And fans just said, I don't want to watch.
Oh, yeah.
And so the NFL doesn't want anything like that. They don't want any stories that are negative. And therefore, they crush all of this as quietly as possible. There's absolutely stuff that's going on behind the scenes that the NFL headquarters and the commissioner are well aware of that are never going to come out in the light of day. They're never going to be in a newspaper report. NFL security, which is a bunch of guys, for the most part, that are former FBI federal agents who are well-versed on intelligence activities and know how to keep things hush-hush.
Sure. That makes sense. And yeah, now that I think about it, since you mentioned millions and millions of dollars at stake, that can also attract a lot of really good talent, right? Like counterintelligence and human intelligence and that sort of thing as well. So I'm probably bringing a lot of power and capability to some of these techniques, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if, the NFL, they're going to hire former high-ranking FBI members. Why? Because they've got all these connections. If you hire someone out who used to be in charge of the FBI in major cities, then one, they're probably going to be, okay, great. You were in charge of, the FBI Los Angeles field office. Great. Then if we have anything come up in the LA area that we need to squash, we know you've got the contacts to be able to make that happen.
Wow. Okay.
Absolutely. Yep.
Very, very cool. Layers and layers to this stuff, isn't there?
Yeah, there really is.
So since we're talking a little bit about technical collection, I know that there have been some concerns, maybe justified or maybe not, about like bugging of hotel rooms, bugging of locker rooms. Is that really a serious issue that takes place?
Yeah, it absolutely is. So what I will say is, in my research, I did not find any confirmed instances of any hotel room or NFL office or anything like that being bugged. However, what I did find was an instance of this taking place in college football, where it took place, and it took place by a college coach who became an NFL coach.
Okay.
So to think that it doesn't go on in the NFL and hasn't taken place, I think is unlikely. Having said that, there have been numerous instances where NFL teams have suspected that a bug was placed in a locker room. So many people suspected that Al Davis of the Raiders was involved in doing this. Mickey Loomis, the owner of the Saints, was investigated by the NFL. He was believed to actually have had I believe it was a listening device and a camera inside of opponents' locker rooms. Mm-hmm. Nothing ever came of that, but you also didn't hear very much about that. So, and then you've got like Peyton Manning. Whenever he would go and play the Patriots in New England, he would not communicate anything of strategic value inside of the locker room. He would actually, he would use two strategies. One, he would drag, like if an assistant coach wanted to talk to him or the head coach, he would drag them outside of the locker room to have that conversation. Wow. The other technique he used was to drag people inside of the shower room, turn on all the showers so that you've got background noise, and then communicate as silently as possible to talk about whatever strategies he need to with his wide receiver group or whoever.
Man, just a very, very smart guy. No question about it.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned also, like, there was an anecdote of Drew Brees and his wife. They would even do that like in their hotel room, right? When they were concerned about, was it the draft, I think, that they were worried about, or being traded, maybe?
Yeah. So Drew Brees, he was a Charger before he went to the Saints and became his, Hall of Fame level quarterback that he became. And when he was with the Chargers, his final year there, he got injured, and pretty substantially. And so teams weren't really quite sure how well he was going to be able to play in the future, and he was obviously commanding a lot of money because he was a really, really good quarterback. And so it came down to a couple teams that were looking at, picking him up. And so he was very concerned that his wife actually was very concerned that a team would put a listening device in their hotel rooms to be able to try to figure out, to listen to their conversations that we're having about, what's his current status on his health, and what teams is he leaning at playing for, and all the negotiations that go on with that. And so I believe her name was Brittany. His wife took Drew Brees into their bathroom and pretty much did the same type of Peyton Manning strategy of turning the water on to make sure that they could have those conversations without the risk of a listening device being planted in there and a team listening in.
Man, that's so impressive to have your family members just as switched on and alert as you are and as you have to be when you're playing at that level. I'm sure I really came away with a positive impression of her.
So Drew Brees did note that they had been watching a lot of spy movies before that. So, there may have been a little paranoia from that coming out.
Sure. Well, I guess you can't be too careful when that amount of money and that kind of career arc is on the line. Certainly can't blame him for taking those precautions, and who knows if they were valid or not.
Right.
But he's a Hall of Famer now, so it all worked out.
It did. It sure did.
So there were so many techniques, honestly, that you talked about, and so many vulnerabilities as well. Can you talk a little bit about the playbooks and how they're guarded and how they're stolen as well sometimes? Because I know those things are like solid gold, seems like.
Yeah, so playbooks are probably one of the absolute most protected things that teams have. And so they're kind of like basically diagram all the plays. That and play sheets, which kind of are scripted, what plays are a team going to run for usually the first 10, 15 plays. Those are the two kind of like gems that no team wants to let out. So when it comes to playbooks, teams take a lot of strategies. Back in the day, everything was on paper, a paper version of playbooks. So what they would do is, one, that you get assigned a playbook, okay? And you do not lose a playbook. If you lose a playbook, teams would issue extremely heavy fines in the tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. They do not play around when it comes to losing a playbook. Now, would they actually find that amount? It depends, right? Is it someone who just made an honest mistake? Is it gross negligence? What went into it? But they certainly threaten that. So they're willing to go to that extremes to be able to protect those playbooks. If they're lost, they will bring in security to go look for them. They will bring in police. They'll call the police to help them search for them and all of that. Nowadays, playbooks are typically put on iPads and loaded there. And the benefit to doing that is, one, the iPad is password protected. So, no one can just pick it up and be able to see what's in it. iPads they can also they set it up so that the team security can just wipe the iPad clean remotely. And so if an iPad does go missing, they simply go, hey, delete, and they don't really have to worry about it. And they simply issue that player a new iPad with the playbook back on it. And it's not as big of a concern.
Okay. Okay, I got you.
Yep. So back in the day, though, crazy things used to go on. Teams have actually left fake playbooks behind in locker rooms, and fake play sheets just to try to throw the opponent off. Or if nothing else, how much time is an opponent going to spend going through that, trying to decipher it, saying, hey, what can we use? How can we do this? They'll spend tens, hundreds of hours trying to figure out how to take that to, use that to their advantage. So, by putting something fake like that behind, it can potentially be an advantage. Of course, you got to ask yourself, how much time does it take to build the fake, playbook or play sheets? And, so it's a cat and mouse game, just like you have with international espionage. There's a lot of chicanery that's going on, and how much of it is beneficial, how much of it isn't. It's it's tough to decide. It's tough to guess.
Yeah, I can understand that. I love the idea of the fake playbook, but I can totally see it the way you're saying is, if it's going to be believable, it's got to look really good. It's probably going to take as much effort as the real one did, honestly, and then you don't even know what kind of gains you get. Like what if they don't end up stealing it, or exploiting it, for example. So, but it is super clever nonetheless.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about really like what's going on in locker rooms and hotels and practice and all that. What about during the game itself, when things are obviously as fluid as they can possibly be? So is there a lot of collection that's going on as the game is progressing?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, you've got a lot of different stuff going on during a game. So before the use of headsets, you had a lot of signals collection going on. Meaning, often how it was done was a hand signal was sent in by an offensive or defensive coordinator, which corresponded to the upcoming play that was going to be used. And even though those aren't used as much today, although they are sometimes, because you have headset malfunctions, you've got audible calls by the quarterback who's going to switch the play at the line of scrimmage. Although they're not as used as much today, that is still very much taking place. You also have headsets. So what can be going on with headsets? You have the potential for another team to be listening in to the headsets, which is a concern. And a much bigger concern is just headset, blocking the signal to headsets so that a coach isn't able to communicate with the player, the offensive or defensive player on the field. And that is very much something that coaches are concerned about, that is believed to have taken place and to continue taking place. And there's very, very good evidence for that, which I list out in the book. Wow, yeah, wow. That is absolutely something that takes place.
Wow, that's high stakes, but it also sounds extremely high risk to me to be using like a directional signal jammer or something like that. Yeah, with all those cameras, obviously, and police, and yeah, that seems like a very risky move, but also high payoff. Like you said, if you can prevent your opponent from communicating with each other, that's a dangerous game they're playing.
Absolutely. It is. So you've got some few other things. You've got like lip reading that goes on during a game. So this is why you see the coordinators, when they're calling in plays, they will put the play sheet up over their mouth so that they lip reader can't be able to decipher what play's coming in. And I actually sat down with someone who used to do this. He actually was a professional lip reader. Oh, wow. He was used by a professional team in the past, and he had gone to the Gallaudet School of Death and played football for them. And so I interviewed him just to see, hey, how good is this guy really, and how much do coaches really have to be paranoid about this? And what I found was, oh my gosh, the guy was incredible. He was known, and he was referred to me as the Michael Jordan of lip reading.
Oh, wow.
And so, he was obviously one of the best, but he could decipher about 80% of all words that I used when giving him fake play calls.
Oh, wow.
He was, a play call is broken down into about 3 different parts, between 2 and 4, depending on if it's on an offensive or a defensive play call. And he could frequently be able to decipher all of at least 2 or 3 portions of a play call, which gave you a whole bunch of information. Was it a pass? Was it a run? A bunch of key vital information. And if you're getting nothing but, is it a pass or is it a run? I mean, what a huge, huge advantage, right? And so, so that goes on. I think one of the other more interesting techniques, there's a bunch of different game techniques, but wristband collection. So a lot of quarterbacks will have, play calls on their wristbands, and coaches really don't love that. They really want the quarterback to be able to memorize an entire play call that they're calling in on the headset, and that the quarterback can repeat it to his team. But, it's a lot of memorization, and some quarterbacks, there may be a new quarterback to the team, maybe a new head coach with new plays, or maybe it's a quarterback just doesn't have the mental ability to remember all of that. So instead of calling in a very long play, they'll simply say 51. And the quarterback can look down on his wristband and say, oh, 51. Okay, that's this play. And then he reads the whole play in the huddle off to the teammates, who then know their assignments and what they need to do. Well, to try to figure out those plays, what teams will do is, when there's a big pileup and the quarterback's in those pileups, one of those defensive players is going to try to steal that wristband from the quarterback. And then, he doesn't want the other team to even know, he doesn't want to even be found out. So he's typically going to take that wristband and do something like shove it down his shorts so that, nobody even knows where it went. And then he's going to smuggle that thing over to his coaches and then hand them that, and they can figure out what to try to do with it. And there are players on, the best teams are going to have guys who are assigned to do things like try to figure out how to use that information. So that if there's a lip reader that they're using and the coach calls in 51 and he thinks, hey, that's secure, it's a 51. They don't know what that means. There's a whole play that's assigned to it. Well, if you have the wristband and it has 51, this is the play. And if you can figure out what that play is that you're calling in, and teams spend a lot of time trying to figure all this stuff out in a whole bunch of different ways, then you can know what the upcoming play is. So, it's not just one method. They're using all these methods combined, just like in the world of, international espionage. It's not just one technique that you're using to find information and to validate information. Teams are using a whole variety of techniques to collect and validate the information that they're gathering.
Man, incredible stuff. I know it's developed over many years, but still, it's just astonishing the level and the layers of things that are going on during a dynamic contact sport like this. There's still so much passing back and forth that most people just don't realize at all. That's very cool. One of my favorite stories from the book, if you don't mind, if you can recall this one specifically, involved one of our favorite subjects here, which is the honey trap here on the podcast. So, and that was, I understand that was not, this specific one was not an NFL game, but it was a college game, right?
Right. That is correct. Yeah. And I simply brought up this illustration to, if you don't think that, obviously, elicitation techniques are out there and all teams are doing them. Peyton Manning was, he was a guy who was famous for trying to do this elicitation technique. He would actually buy Mai Tais for fellow Pro Bowlers at the Pro Bowl to try to get them to start talking about their team and all these sensitive topics, And Ty Law, who played for the Patriots, was once quoted, he was quoted as saying, I'm not going to fall for that pain, in a little more rude terms.
Uh-huh.
But the elicitation technique obviously goes on, and it's taken place in college football with a honey trap. So this took place back in 1987 when Barry Switzer was the coach there at University of Oklahoma. And one of his players actually came to him and told him a pretty wild story. And what he said was that while he was going out to the parking lot, a woman came up to him who claimed to be Janelle Dior, which is a famous heiress to the Dior fortune. And they struck up a conversation and then a relationship. And he ended up living at her apartment all throughout the season. And after the final game of the season took place, he went back to the apartment and it was emptied out. She wasn't there. The furniture is gone. There's nothing. And so he went and he found the house cleaner that had been used. And the house cleaner notified him that she had been talking to someone. And so the team ended up doing an investigation about all of this. And what resulted was they learned that she was actually an undercover informant and a journalist from the Dallas Times-Herald. Well, she was an informant of a journalist, I should say. And she had been recording a bunch of the conversations that had been going on with that team member and his teammates. So, one of the biggest rivalries in college football is between the University of Oklahoma and the University of Texas. Mm-hmm. So, the question is, what were they doing with that? Why were they trying? Some people, the claim was that they were trying to get a story on drug use at the University of Oklahoma among the football players. They could, run a big article on the team and have this scandal. Now, what would have that done to the University of Oklahoma program? You're probably talking the loss of tons of scholarships if that had taken place, if it was revealed. So, and then the question becomes, was this an independent investigation done by the newspaper, or was it also done in conjunction with the University of Texas and their team and their coach? So you've got all these factors that come into play that are very, very interesting. And, the bottom line is that full story, I doubt is ever going to come out, how much involvement there was between, the University of Texas, or whether it was just an investigator who was a fan of the team that was willing to do stuff on their behalf, because you do have members of the public out there that are willing to support their team. And if they get a chance to take, to do some of these espionage activities, they'll take it upon themselves and try to, help out their team in whatever way they can. And, the same thing goes on in the NFL.
Yeah. I think you mentioned several times, like, fans have just inadvertently found a playbook or something along those lines. And we're like, I can, help my own team out by turning this over to them, and not even, maybe expecting some game day tickets or something like that, but not turning it into like a mercenary action, really. So I was amazed. You got this, like we said earlier, you got this whole drop-in network there for every team everywhere they go. It's pretty incredible stuff. And this honeypot story, it really just brings up so many questions. Honestly, this is what, a 4-month operation or something, an entire season, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Did this girl not have a full-time job or school or anything? I mean,
so she was an informant. Yeah, so, she was probably paid a pretty hefty salary to be able to pull this off. I mean, you're talking an operation where she was pretending to be a member of the Dior family. So, she's not going to be living in some slummy apartment either. You're talking, there was some serious money that was thrown into this.
Yeah, money, and presumably weeks, if not months of preparation as well, like target selection, like everything that goes into a successful work like that is extremely complex.
And so, and that's why I really think there's probably most likely was a tie with the University of Texas, because is a newspaper going to have those types of funds to throw around?
Right.
I barely, I find that very questionable. But if you're an NFL booster who are known to spend tons and tons of money on their teams, back in the day, they were spending lots of money to be able to give recruits cars, buy them fancy cars and whatnot. They frequently would hand out tens and hundred thousands of dollars for this type of stuff to go on. So a University of Texas booster, would he be willing to pay $200,000 to be able to, pay the salary, to get an apartment, to furnish it, to do all this type of stuff? Yeah, that is very, very possible, and in line with stuff that has gone on in the past in college football.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I can totally see that. And not only that, but the thrill of putting together something like this, funding something like this. I mean, that's like the trifecta for some people.
I mean, these guys they're rich as anything, some of these boosters, right? And this becomes a great story to share with their buddies, right? So absolutely, that's very, very plausible.
Yeah, just fascinating story. And I know there's not a heck of a lot to go on, unfortunately, but I have a feeling there is certainly like a lot more to that story, and I would love to know the resolution of all that. Kevin, what about players? I actually hadn't even considered this before, but players are sometimes, I guess, kind of like vindictive if they've been traded or if they haven't been used to their full potential, something like that. Like the players themselves can become like the insider threat, right?
Yeah, that is a very real concern. So there's a number of ways that goes on. Sometimes it's just a simple matter of a player or a coach switching teams. And when they do, all of the information that they know leaves with them and is transferred to the other team. So what does that mean? So everything from, anything they know in regards to signals for another team, they're going to share when it comes to, if they know, like, let's say they played with Tom Brady, they'll be like, hey, Tom Brady, he's got a couple weaknesses that maybe other people haven't picked up on. He really doesn't like it when opponents do this or do that. And so they'll share all this type of information, but it can be much darker too. There are times where when a player ends his career and doesn't necessarily have the money to maintain the lifestyle that he used to have, or has gambling debts that he needs to pay off. A lot of these former players are still allowed access to the team, to the practice field. And so they'll go. And what has happened in the past is some of these guys have been approached by other teams and been paid to provide sensitive information that they come across. And so, that's a very, very, that's a concern. And the other concern that you have out there is existing employees, not necessarily just the players and coaches, but you've got a large administrative staff with every team. And some of those offices overlook practice fields. And so, there are teams that are so paranoid at times that they will actually go and have all the shutters or blinds of offices, they'll have all of them shut by a security member to make sure that even the staff members on a team aren't able to watch the practices.
Wow. Because
they're worried that someone could be hired and go to work for another team, which is very, very plausible when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is just industrial espionage, which goes on all the time, where you hire someone out. Well, one business hires an employee to go work for another company or another team in this case to be able to provide inside information. And that is a very, very big concern in the NFL as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. They've really got the full spectrum of problems to deal with, just like any government organization almost.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the one thing I really noticed in the research of my book. I thought maybe there would just be a few collection techniques that are involved in, the world of the NFL. But the more and more I researched, the more I found that, man, it's just like the world of international espionage. All the same type of tactic and techniques are, for the most part, are going on and are being used.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is incredible. That's why I keep saying this book was like such a welcome surprise for me, honestly. So really glad I found it. Kevin, you've mentioned a couple of times now, you've alluded to Spygate. So can you talk about what that was? Because it was such a defining moment for the NFL, I guess. Like, how did that begin and where did it end?
Yeah. So Spygate was probably the NFL's biggest spy-related scandal in its in its history. So it involved the New England Patriots under coach Bill Belichick. And it started in roughly the preseason of 2000 and went on all the way until week 1 of the 2007 season. And what the Patriots were doing were video recording the signals that coordinators were sending in, particularly the use of defensive signals. Because at the time, there was no headset communication between the defensive coordinator and a defensive player. So they had to rely on hand signals to tell the defense, for the defensive coordinator to tell the defense how they wanted to defend the upcoming play. Mm-hmm. So the Patriots were recording these signals and using a variety of techniques to help them out, such as interviewing former players from their team. So what they would do is go like, hey, I know this signal last season used to correspond to this play, because they were not just taping the signal, they would take the signal and then the upcoming play so that they could splice the two together and understand for future use, okay, if we see this signal, we know this is the upcoming play. Wow. Right? And then furthermore, they would do things like interview players coming from other teams and sometimes sign players to the practice squad for the sole purpose of having them share information about signals to be able to go, hey, we know last season this signal was used, and then they would show them the signal. Does that still correspond to this play? And the player would go, yes or no, or maybe so, right? Mm-hmm. And so they used, they had a quite an elaborate system to be able to use this. And it was so effective at times that the Patriots knew every single defensive play call that was going into a game. So, if a team was going to blitz, they knew it. Some games they knew every single blitz that was going to take place before it happened. So you think about what a huge advantage that is, at a time when they were winning Super Bowl after Super Bowl. Mm-hmm. Big advantage. And so, so that's the basis of, what Spygate was all about.
Okay. So how did all of that come to light? Ultimately, was it just like a accumulation of people noticing this kind of thing, or was there somebody come forward or something like that?
Yeah. So it came forward when a former coach of the Patriots switched over and became the head coach of another team. And so this happened with Coach Mangini, Eric Mangini. He went over and became the head coach of the Jets in 2007. And before the Patriots and the Jets ever played in week 1, Mangini actually called Belichick because he knew what was going on. He was well aware of all this. And he said, hey, you're coming to New York. Do not try to record our signals during the game. Okay? I don't want to see any of it. And Belichick, for whatever reason, his hubris or whatever, he said, you know what? I don't care. We're going to do it anyway. And the Jets set up security staff to watch for this. And then when they saw it, they gave them enough time for the Patriots to actually do some filming. And then the security staff detained the Patriots member who was doing the video recording. And then they turned turned over their evidence to NFL security. And that's how the Patriots got caught.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I recall this, popping up, and it was in the news for quite some time. What were the consequences for the Patriots? I mean, did they come down as hard? Did the league come down as hard as they should have? I mean, I assume they would typically try to, sweep this stuff under the rug.
Right. So the Patriots as an organization were fined $250,000, which
that's not as much as I was expecting.
That's a few nickels for you and I, right? Belichick gets fined $500,000, a little more substantial there, and they lose a first round draft pick for the 2008 draft. So, it was, I would say, maybe a moderate level punishment for something that had gone on for 7 years. Now, what I will say is, and I think this is one of the reasons they didn't get hit harder than they did by the NFL. From 2000 all the way up until a portion of the 2006 season, there was not a rule or a bylaw that forbid the recording of signals. It was kind of a gray area. So when teams started complaining, because numerous teams started noticing that the Patriots were doing this, they complained to the NFL. The NFL issued out 2 different memorandums saying, hey, this isn't permitted, don't do it. But you know what? It really never made any official NFL rules or bylaws. So, the Patriots could argue, and argue justly, that, hey, there's nothing really that says that we can't do this. The NFL and the commissioner just simply stated, hey, we issued the memos, we didn't want it to be done, and you did it anyway. And so that becomes a point of consternation between Belichick and Goodell over, Belichick's maintained innocence up until the very end, that we did nothing wrong, and to a certain degree, that's actually true. It just depends on how much weight you think a memo carries.
Yeah. Understandable. Yeah, I understand them putting forward that defense. I'm curious, what about fan reaction, whether from the Patriots fans or any opposing teams? Like, did, the Patriots lose a lot of their, kind of catch it with their own fans, or do those guys just not care as long as they kept winning?
So I will just say from my personal experience of interacting with plenty of Patriots fans that no one cared. They were winning Super Bowls, and nobody cared. Frankly, not even Robert Kraft, the owner of the Patriots, cared.
Oh, wow.
So he went to the next NFL, meeting with other owners after this took place and basically broke down in tears and just said, oh, I can't believe this took place. It is so, so terrible. I'm so ashamed. And then, like a week or two after, the NFL issued all its fines, and after this meeting that Robert Kraft went to with the other NFL team owners, he gives Belichick he signs him to a new contract a year early and gives him way more money. So it pretty much, to me, seemed like Belichick was giving the middle finger to the NFL.
Wow.
And said that Robert Kraft just said, I don't care. NFL, you can fine us. You can do whatever. Belichick's winning me Super Bowls, and I don't care about the rest.
Dang. So ultimately it all blew over. I mean, did you think that they continued to record the signals as they were before, or did that kind of die off?
So that's an interesting question. And, to be honest, when you started asking me about initially why I wrote the book, one of my very initial thoughts as a Broncos fan, when the Broncos got busted for recording a practice of another team, was I said, you know what? If I'm the Patriots and I was caught doing this, you can't do it again. If you got caught doing this again, like, the punishment would be so severe, it'd be catastrophic. If I was them, what I would do is I would pay for one of my former coaches that went to another team to do it for the other team around the league, keep recording signals, and then send it back to me. And in return, the Patriots, off the books, could give him millions or tens of millions of dollars. That was my initial thought when the Broncos got busted. Now, did I ever find any evidence for it? I did not. But if you want to know the real reason I wrote the book, when you're talking about, really complex intelligence operations, that's the type of stuff that can go on. And did it? I don't know. I would say most likely not. And obviously when McDaniels went to the Broncos, was he doing his best to win games for the Broncos? Most likely, absolutely. Could he have done his best to win game for the Broncos and made a cool $10 million on the side, passing signals back to the Patriots when he hired a former Patriots videographer in Denver?
Oh, wow.
That had been involved in the Spygate, everything Spygate? I'm just saying, it makes you wonder I don't think it took place, but that's what initially had gone through my head and had really gone, man, how deep is this stuff? That'd be pretty crazy and sophisticated, but there really is some high level espionage that's taken place in the NFL.
Certainly.
So, the other, one of the big things that came out of Spygate was the NFL put into place the use of headsets for a defensive coordinator to a defensive team member so that they could communicate with each other. So that was one of the big things that came out of it. But there were many other things. The Senate, they threatened to conduct an investigation about Spygate unless they felt like the NFL handled it appropriately. And so, there was a lot of fallout when it came to the league's popularity after that. Lots of people just said, you know what, I don't want to watch this if I think the game's rigged like this. Mm-hmm. So, the NFL did everything in their own, they could to possibly hush this story up and to deal with it as quickly as possible. As a result, the investigation that the NFL led was, well, let's say this, the punishment for Spygate was issued before the investigation was ever conducted.
Oh my gosh.
Which is ridiculous.
Yeah. Wow.
And what else were the Patriots involved in that never, ever even got investigated? There was a lot. Mm-hmm. Coaches had been complaining about the Patriots for years for all different types of collection techniques, including sneaking a person into the locker room to steal playbooks and play sheets. And anonymously, a former Patriots coach said it wasn't signals collection that helped the Patriots the most during the Spygate era. It was stealing play sheets out of opponents' locker rooms. Thanks. Which, you think about it, with a play sheet, that tells you exactly what play an offense is going to run for the first 10 to 15 plays. Mm-hmm. Now, if you know what play is going to be run, and you can pretty well shut it down, right? If you know what's coming up. And it's only 3 plays before a team's got a punt. If they know 15 plays, they know 5 offensive series. What's going to take place for 5 offensive series for basically an entire half of what an opponent's going to do. Man. Exactly what's going to happen. And so there's a lot of things that the NFL should have investigated coming out of Spygate that they weren't. Why didn't they do it? They didn't want anything coming into the light of day, into the public awareness. They want it to appear that the playing field is as even as possible, even when it's completely rigged. But that's how the NFL operates. Mm-hmm. It's a business. It is not about. It's not always about fairness. The NFL wants that. They do. But if it comes down to a question of making money versus fairness, they're going to do whatever makes them money.
Yeah.
They're more concerned with perception than they are reality.
Of course. Yeah, my big takeaway from this book, and especially from Spygate, really is that the benefit outweighs the cost of all of these activities, really. So I don't really see them slowing down if that's going to continue to be the case.
Yeah, it's just like industrial espionage. They're doing it because it's a cheap, cost-effective way to gather information and sometimes make you millions and tens of millions of dollars. And it does the same in the NFL with, every win is worth tens of millions. Mm-hmm. You win a playoff game, it's worth even more. Mm-hmm. You win a Super Bowl, invaluable.
Oh yeah.
Invaluable.
Yeah. No doubt about it. Incredible. Kevin, this, like I said, I really love this book. It really just opened my eyes to so many things I didn't know. For those of you who are big sports fans and maybe you haven't gotten that itch scratched here on the podcast yet, you're not going to want to miss this book. Once again, it is Spies on the Sidelines, The High Stakes World of NFL Espionage by Kevin Bryant. So we will link it up in the show notes for you. Kevin, do you have like a website or social media pages or anything like that you'd like to share if people want to follow along or connect with you afterwards?
Yeah, social media is the best way to be able to connect with me. I'm up there on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Everything is Kevin Bryant author.
Okay.
Some of them are like a Kevin Bryant .author, but if you look up Kevin Bryant author, you'll be able to find me.
Yeah.
And if you want to email me, if you got some interest in something or a story you want to share, kevinbryant.author@gmail.com.
Okay, too easy. Yeah, we'll put those in the show notes as well. Are you working on another book? Do you have anything else that you want to write about now that this one's been out for a little while?
So I am. I've taken a little pause. I've got a daughter who's in high school, so I'm taking a little time to enjoy those last few years while she's at home. I am working on a book, same topic, but for college football.
Oh, very cool. Okay, great.
Yeah, while it's very similar, there's a lot of differences between the rules in college football and the NFL, which means there's different types of spying activity and that take place because of that. And college football has a much longer history. And there's a lot more teams. So you get a lot more stories that are available out there in college football than what's available in the pros, which I think just makes it that much better.
Yeah, certainly. That's almost hard to believe, honestly, because your book was so full of them already. I mean, I read a lot of books, for this podcast, of course, and yours is one of the most like anecdote heavy of any book that I've read. So to imagine double or triple that for college football is really something else, honestly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. I really appreciate your time. This is a fascinating story, and I really am looking forward to your next book as well, whenever that might be. So thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Justin. Appreciate you having me on.
Of course. Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.